Welcome to the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast. Many thanks for joining us today on the Journal of Biophilic Design. First of all, we've got some really exciting news. We've got the magazine that comes out this month in October. It's coming out as an ebook, Kindle edition. So please go to Kindle and order it. Also, there's a beautiful full colour hardback edition coming out. It's over 100 pages. It's full of research, opinions on this theme is the workplace. But there's also regular sections on plants, well-being, the environment as well, and the city, biophilic cities, as well as there being a specific research-led, evidence-based section on the science behind biophilic design. So very, very exciting. So please go to journalofbiophilicdesign.com and there's a page on the website which tells you all about it. So please do register, sign up for our newsletter and basically get involved. Thanks so much for your support. But here today, we are really excited to be joined by Gary Thornton. He's Associate Lighting Director at Nolte Lighting. He has actually written us an excellent article on the importance and the power of light and how you can light biophilically in the magazine. So please do check his article out. But Gary, many thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you. Very pleased to be here.
That's lovely. Well, Gary as well is actually speaking at Workplace Trends. We're a media partner for Workplace Trends. It's going to be taking place on the 18th of October in London, and Gary is speaking there. So maybe before we sort of go ahead and go down the whole thing, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, Gary, a bit about you, the company, and what you do, please?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I'm an associate lighting designer at Nolte. We are an independent lighting design practice, pretty much working across all sectors from individual private resi right up to big city master plans and consulting and inputting on lighting frameworks and strategies, kind of one end to the other and everything in between as well, from hospitality and commercial spaces, increasingly what I'm focusing on as a big chunk of my role within the team. I've been in the lighting industry for about 12 years or so, and I can confirm it never stands still, always pushing technology, always pushing innovation, and increasingly recently with a slant towards sustainability and circularity in products and workspaces, all of which are sort of biophilic design or biophilic philosophy can encompass as well. So I think there's a really of the moment time for lighting to come to the fore.
That's excellent to hear. It's really good because light is so important, obviously for so many reasons, which you're going to tell us about. But what got you into lighting? First of all, it's sort of quite a niche thing. So
it is, and it's almost embarrassingly, but not uncommon. It was purely by accident. I studied product design at university and always had an interest in kind of the lighting from a product design point of view, and I had a sort of interest in photography where the understanding of light is incredibly important as well. And then post graduating, to be frank, the job market wasn't overly buoyant, and so the whole raft of us were scrabbling for anything with design or designer in the job description, and I found myself kind of interning at an architectural lighting practice. And it was there only when I found myself doing lighting design that I realized architectural lighting design was its own discipline, was its own kind of fundamental consultancy role, and absolutely fell in love with it and been here ever since.
Fantastic. Sounds really, really good. Can you explain, you mentioned biophilic design earlier there, and can you explain why lighting is important, just generally, and also how it fits into the biophilic design philosophy, please?
Yeah, I guess in its purest sense, biophilia is the love and connection with nature that I think so many of us try and articulate. But it's biophilic design as a philosophy is kind of being inspired by this, taking cues from this and seeing how we can weave that into the built environment. Because we are an add-on to nature. So if we want to biophilic design, it's looking what nature's already doing, what it's been doing for many years, and kind of pulling that into our own schemes, invariably interior schemes, but anything that's built and man-made, how we can look at that. Because, effectively we are a diurnal species. We evolved under light and darkness for much longer than we've been under artificial light. And so we have this really powerful component in daylight. And I think, one of the best things I could do is ask you to imagine a scene of nature in your head. It might be a beach, it might be a forest, it might be a meadow. What it will almost certainly have is an element of lighting to it, natural light. And I think even if your imagined place or your safe, your warm place to go to is somewhere at night, it will invariably have a starry sky in your imagination. We have this ingrained ability to imagine and contextualize natural light or the absence of natural light in our heads. We know exactly what lighting should look like and how it performs. And often when we come into a space and it feels a bit jarring or cold, it's because it's not how we're expecting it to look. But all humans have this innate built-in sort of ethos in the back of their head, in their imagination, to be able to picture exactly what natural light should look like and how it should be performing. And I think a biophilic approach to what we do is trying to pull some of those cues inwards into the built environment. So looking at trying to create an aesthetic that moves and shifts throughout the day, that isn't static, because daylight isn't. Any of those time lapses, you see the shadows panning across the sky and things like that. And so one of the things, I mean, obviously biased but towards lighting slightly, but a lot of things in a workspace, for example, are static. They are fixed. The walls don't change color. The tables often don't usually change position. But the one thing that can shift over the course of the day is the lighting scheme. And so arguably we've got this ability to influence behavior and the look and feel of a space more so than any other discipline.
That's really, it's interesting because I mean I've always somehow always been very connected to lighting, and sort of I'm affected by lighting. I've worked in offices where they've had those sort of flickery things. This was like in the 90s, when it was like really banks of desks, and I found myself being very aggravated and sad and squished and And it's lovely to hear what you've really articulated that incredibly well about our innate connection and sort of ability, and it's just like it's in our essence really to understand light.
I think it's baked into us so much. But as I say, we evolved under it for far longer than we've been under artificial light. So it's there, but whether we know it or not, consciously, subconsciously, unconsciously, it's there somewhere in the back of our heads. For all those years we spent evolving under it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, obviously we're going to talk about biophilic design in interventions with lighting and sort of positivity, but can you give us an example of bad lighting, maybe, and how it affects us if it's wrong?
Yeah, I mean, I think lighting is often, and this is kind of from my own experience, it's one of the unsung heroes of a space, because it's so intangible and it's invisible until it strikes the surface and bounces back towards your eye. Invariably, we haven't specified what that surface is. We might have had a conversation and talked to them about color and texture, but that surface, that piece of furniture, that wall covering wasn't ours to specify. So we're not in sole control of it. But what we have specified is invisible until it strikes that surface and bounces back to you and how you perceive it. And I think you got it bang on a minute ago when you said you've experienced bad lighting and it felt quite oppressive or quite jarring. And I think when it comes to bad lighting, most people can feel it instantly. They might not know it's the lighting. They might not be able to articulate that it's something glaring at them or something a bit too cool and harsh, but it is that flat uniform space. That is those workspaces from 20, 30 years ago with 600 by 600 ceiling panels. Some of them flicker, some of them have gone kind of greenish and taken on or a pinkish hue over time. It is a very flat scheme, but it's sort of unlayered, no visual relief, just a flat and invariably slightly too cool scheme. But I think the overarching thing for me is that bad lighting doesn't consider the people in the space. It doesn't consider how the space is going to be used. So it will often, a bad lighting scheme, or one that needs addressing, is one that will just treat the room or the space like a big empty box with no forecast of who's going to be in it or how they're going to be using that space once they're there. Which is almost the antithesis of what we try and strive for in all our projects.
Yeah, and so in contrast, what would be well, before I do that, how does that how extra does that affect us? I mean, how does, you know, and what you've seen, how have you seen people react? You know,
I mean, I think there's a physical and a physiological element to that. The thing that you touched on, flicker, is one of the most popular complaints by far, because people can perceive different rates of flicker. You might be able to see something flickering that I might not pick up on me. There's also imperceptible flicker that could be giving you headaches, even if your eye can't see it. So kind of headaches and migraines is obviously a huge downside to it, but also glare. You know, so some of the fittings, even modern day LED fittings, just because it's LED doesn't make it good per se. But even some modern day fittings can be extremely glary. Again, it's usually because the fitting is inappropriately located, hasn't considered who's sitting where in the space, and maybe you've got something shining right into your face when you're trying to do some work on a screen. So, you know, at best, bad lighting is preventing efficiency, preventing from people doing the work. And, you know, it's not a space that people want to come back to. It's not a space they enjoy being in. And at the much worse end, you've got headaches and migraines and perceptible flicker and all things that contribute to physical detriment to a person as well.
Because that has psychological effect as well, doesn't it? So people just, you know,
completely. And I think it's relatively recently that we've been able to articulate this and contribute it to well-being and sort of mental health, particularly how, you know, if you don't want to be, if a space isn't making you feel welcome and sort of empowering to come in and do your job, and somewhere you like to visit time and time again, you won't want to be going into an office. You won't want to be going into a space. And so that puts extra stresses on you, because, you know, you're sitting on the train in the morning, almost fretting about the space that you've got to go and spend 6, 7, 8 hours in, knowing that it's not conducive to making you feel very good.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe in contrast then, what would be an example of good lighting, sort of beneficial lighting, and then and how would that sort of like transform those feelings and the sort of the psychological and mental and physical well-being?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna say a phrase just to get it out of the way, but human-centric lighting, I don't like it as a phrase. It's become a bit of a buzzword, because, you know, all artificial lighting schemes should be human-centric. Who are we lighting for if it's not people and ourselves? You know, most plants, animals, the rest of the world gets on fine without artificial lighting. Everything we implement is for us. So for me, the idea of human-centric lighting is a sort of marketing buzzword that has lost meaning slightly, because it's what we should be doing. But I think the idea of something being human-centric, putting people first, front and center of a scheme, is where we start. Even pre-concept, you know, trying to establish a brief with a client. Why do you want to light this space? How's it going to be used? Who's going to be in it? Does it need to be flexible or rigid? Do you need certain light levels, or do you not? And I think once you start to establish some of these things, you almost write your own brief for the client and say, look, this is what we're going to do. This is why we're going to do it. And then starting to put in layers of light, lots of different visual data. So I think, you know, workplace is a good example, as most people who experience these. Predominantly, your lighting will come from a very high level at the ceiling. That's where most of your functional lighting will come from. But if you consider flicker rate and color temperature, you can make it a very comfortable and welcoming environment. As well as that sort of high level data, you've got the amount of light that falls on your desk. Often people design to a standard, which increasingly is overlighting a space. You know, lots of the standards are written based on how much we're doing paper-based work rather than screen-based work, and they're still catching up ever so slightly. But it's much easier to put perhaps a slightly lower light level on the desk as standard, and give people a task lamp, localize their control, give them some input and choice to what they're doing. And if they feel that they want a bit of a boost, they can switch it on. It doesn't really affect anybody else, but it gives them control and sort of empowers them to take control over the lighting within their space. The other thing we can look at, as well as creating these horizontal datums, is look at your vertical surfaces. Probably in your peripheral now, and everything I'm looking at around me, we've got vertical walls. If we don't light those directly, then they can often look not dark, but they will look gloomy by comparison of all the very brightly lit horizontal surfaces. And so creating this horizon line, creating this backdrop of things we're looking at, is a really powerful way to enhance the space. It's sort of techniques we've been using in hospitality for a long time, in hotels, in bars and restaurants. And actually, particularly as we're all coming back from a sort of fairly turbulent couple of years, creating spaces that are not overcompensating, but really leaning into creating an experience or creating a destination where we want people to spend time, recognizing how this contributes to well-being and your perception and feeling of a space. It's looking at all these different layers of light rather than just having something in the ceiling and a monitor in front of you. That can feel very stark and static. And actually, I think we've learned that isn't overly comfortable for people.
No, exactly. I think that's a really good idea. I mean, you've mentioned it, like just saying, and you think it's like so obvious, actually, to kind of light uniformly for like people and for the space, and so it looks beautiful and like aesthetically lovely, or pleasing, or it's good for like transient and like moving down the office and stuff like that. But actually, having a desk lamp or something where the person can control. And what a genius idea. I mean, I know in your article you talk about that, and you obviously the sort of human-centric, the people-centric, but you talk about people having a choice. And also, the whole pandemic thing that like you just touched on, we've been locked away. We've been working from home, so we've had like total control over, most of us anyway. But we even then we have control of where we put our desk, whether it's like, we switch the light on in the kitchen or not, or whether we've got a dedicated office space that we're next to the window. What we create our space for us, for our to optimize what we're doing, because we can. So when you go back to the office, if you don't have control over that, you're not going to want to go back, are you? It's going to take a lot of kind of enticing too. And I think in your article, it's brilliant, because it's about actually giving people back choice, because then that will entice people back to the office. It will create better mindsets and stuff. I mean, can you explain a little bit more about that? Can you sort of expand a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a very good summary, really, sort of leading into the question. But I think, the idea of choice, exactly. We spent the best part of 2 years, if not slightly more, at home, curating our own workspace from what we wanted to sit on, what we wanted to look at, how much light we had. Did we pull a blind down and it was slightly more diffuse? Did we put the big light on? Did we put a task light on? All of these things we had at our fingertips. And so I don't think we can give all of those nuances to people in a workspace that's being shared with tens or even hundreds of people. But what we can do is be adaptable, be flexible, and give people a choice. That simplest thing is a small task light or desk light that's got a little local switch on it. The stuff in the ceiling, the stuff around you, invariably is on a lighting control system that's got timers and sensors associated with it, so we're not lighting portions of the office that don't need lighting. We've got daylight sensors around the perimeter of the office, so we're deliberately dimming artificial lighting in the ceiling when there is sufficient daylight coming in through the glazing. And I think coming back again, it's considering how people are using the space. So a lot of workspaces now, people are being encouraged to come back into the office, but they have to be flexible. They have to be adaptable for different pockets of space. Do you want to work in a group? Do you want to work in your own? And I think workplace lighting's historically been very flat and one-dimensional, as we touched on, with those sort of 600 by 600 ceiling panels, and that was it. They were all on, they were all off. They were a slightly awkward hue to make your skin look very good, to make you feel like you're being nice in the space. So what we can do is, again, consider the people in the space. How are people coming back from the homes wanting to use it? Do they want to sit in a slightly more relaxed and informal space, where the color tone is slightly warmer, perhaps? Do they want to sit at a banker desk and do something sort of very focused? Maybe the light temperature is slightly cooler and it does come from overhead. But I think what we're seeing is this idea that people do want to have a say in what they're doing. Again, we're not providing the lighting scheme for the desk or for the carpet, we're providing it for people. So if we don't ask them what they want, we're not going to input a successful scheme. We've got to talk to them about how they want to use it, how they intend to fill the space and populate the space. At one end, it is that very simple task light that gives you localized, zoned control to people. And at the other end, it's kind of the rise of informal pause points and kind of, again, hospitality-led breakout spaces that maybe there's some funky seating, there's a lot more FF&E lighting that makes it feel slightly more residential or slightly softer. These are really creative spaces that people have got used to working in. They've shown that they can do their jobs from these home spaces. And so creating these as sort of mini destinations that's still a formal workplace, but it feels much more residential, less shirts and ties. And it could even be something that we're looking at in a couple of schemes, the dynamism of lighting. So we've got these different layers of lights at different heights and integrated in the joinery, but maybe very subtly, it shifts the brightness and color temperature over the course of a day without anybody inputting. So you have localized zone control that people can do their own task lights for, but with a relatively simple lighting control system, you can have color temperature that varies over the course of the day. So maybe when you come in the morning, it's ever so slightly warmer, and it gets slightly cooler and slightly brighter over the course of a number of hours towards lunchtime. Imperceptibly, you won't notice it when you're working under it, but you may pop out for a coffee and come back in. It feels a bit brighter, a bit crisper. You may come back after lunch and it's slightly punchier and cooler for that, getting over that post-lunch I want a nap kind of slump that a lot of people feel. And then again, sort of winding you down towards the end of the day. So again, getting slightly dimmer and slightly warmer, kind of readying your body and your eyes biologically for when you step outside and maybe the sun is setting or maybe it's already dark, as will be happening very soon. But kind of not in training you specifically, but taking cues from what nature does and artificially sort of building in some of that dynamism and some of that automated shifting of light.
I think that's great. I mean, the circadian rhythm, I think, is really important, I think, for us. And I think, like you say, to create a space and a sort of good lighting design really can enhance all the other aspects of, because there's people listening to this and, interior designers and business owners that might think, oh yeah, they've heard about plants and they've heard about textures and soft furnishings and rounded shapes and pathways and, creating intrigue and prospect and refuge. And so they're implementing all these things, but to actually kind of, it's almost, for me, it's like icing on the cake, literally, because it's white and light. But it is, and it kind of just adds that final bit of finesse, because it just can really create beautiful spaces that are awe-inspiring and can create such joy amongst the people working there. And you mentioned you taking cues from the hospitality space. I think that's really good. I mean, people listening to this, if you're thinking about installing lighting and different lighting or switching it out, I think if you think about like a bar you've gone to or a restaurant you've gone to or a fantastic hotel, you think about the lighting zoning, and it takes you through, and that's obviously also biophilic design, because you're led through where the light is, or you're going towards the light, or you're tired and you want to go towards the darker areas, or you want to sit in the dark areas. I think that really makes a difference. And you obviously talk about zoning as well, which is incredibly important. So do you I mean, you talk about different layers of illumination to bring that whole kind of aspect of daylight. Can you maybe give an example of where you've installed it and just kind of what the results were?
Yeah, so I think, to jump back ever so slightly, the circadian rhythms are incredibly important, and it is the way that human health has entrained itself to this very sort of 24-hour-ish cycle of light and dark. What we can't do with artificial lighting is replicate daylight in its entirety. The spectrum that it has in terms of color temperature is far too broad, and I think actually the brightness that you need to trigger a biological response is upwards in the thousands of lux rather than the hundreds of lux that we put into an interior space. But what we can do is take these cues from daylight, how it performs, how it changes and shifts over the course of a day. And I think what you mentioned about hospitality, a successful hospitality space, a bar or a restaurant, is somewhere that looks and feels great when you walk in, and you want to visit it time and time again. And invariably, it is creating these destinations. Light will be a huge factor, and good lighting will be a huge factor in all of those. And not that we want to make every workplace feel like a hotel, but what we can do is provide a bit of visual relief and a bit of adaptability in commercial spaces that allow you these breakout points. So you have got these destinations and moments that you want to visit over and over again. One example, I guess, on a big project, we did a project at Nolte a few years ago in an office that was a tunable white LED scheme. So I'm not going to use the word circadian because it wasn't fully in training, but taking the idea of what daylight does. Starting at the ceiling, it had a mix of direct and indirect lighting coming from above in a ranging from a very warm to a very cool. So it did that sort of classic graph of when you came in at 7-8 in the morning, it was much warmer and slightly dimmer, and sort of woke you up over the course of the day, and it got brighter and cooler towards lunchtime, up until about early afternoon, where it's very punchy, very crisp and cool, and then slowly dipped in brightness and got warmer towards the end of the day. And that was a mix of indirect and direct lighting at the ceiling, coupled with a number of great feature walls the interior designer put around the edge of the space. So we lit those vertical surfaces, so in your periphery over the tops of your monitor as you were walking around the circulation routes, you had these wonderful lit surfaces framing sort of almost your panoramic vision. If you're facing the window, lucky, good for you, but such is the sort of deep floor plates we're designing with now. Not everybody has direct access to a window, but what you can do is introduce these horizontal moments where people can light those. And again, you had this kind of tunable white circadian LED scheme in the main office space, but the kitchen points and the tea points deliberately a slightly dimmer, slightly warmer static white, so they felt more residential, having lots of pockets of informal seating with lots of decorative and FF&E lighting. So they had a sort of residential bleed coming back into them, so people felt very comfortable in stopping there and having a coffee and maybe bumping into somebody, sort of re-curating those sorts of water cooler moments that happen by chance, but deliberately giving spaces over to that, where moments of creativity can happen, moments of informal chat can happen, and actually then you sort of feel a bit refreshed, and maybe you do wander back to your desk, or you go and find another meeting space, but you've had this kind of wonderful breakup of something that maybe feels very formal and commercial, something slightly more residential, something slightly more hospitality. And it's been very well received. We've been back a couple of times to tweak some of the control system levels over the course of the day. People felt it was getting too cool too quickly or too warm too soon. But on the whole, it must have been a success, because they then expanded into 2 floors above and asked us to come back and relook at a lighting scheme for them there as well. So they're obviously enjoying how it's going. And then we've implemented a sort of very similar scheme, even though we've got different ceiling heights and things there. But what's come around this time is reorientation of meeting rooms. So much like we're doing now, VC is really the future over lots of in-person meetings. And so making sure you've got good levels of vertical illumination to people's faces, so you're not sitting in silhouette, but balanced with the daylight that's coming in. So simple things like window treatments and giving them an option to put a blind down, but also a daylight sensor that's managing how much daylight's coming into the space and automatically shifting the artificial light above you to make sure you're in balance and not using too much energy and sort of being too wasteful in the space.
That's great. I'm going to ask you about plants in a minute, but just before I do that, I want to ask you, what advice would you give to a business, so someone who's listening to this podcast, and that they want to create a sort of a happy, healthy environment for their staff? What bit of advice would you give them? Obviously, I think we would ask them to come to you guys for the design.
Yes, so then that's a sort of precursor for my answer. But I think step one is if a business is looking to do that, it's an acknowledgement that they're not perhaps already providing a biophilic led environment. So that acknowledgement and the desire to want to provide the best environment your staff is really good. One of the best things, I think, is making sure that your biophilic approach is joined up between all disciplines. There's no point in having a beautiful lighting scheme if you've got a very rigid and cellular approach for your office and desks that isn't working for how the space is going to use. There's also no point having lots of lovely furniture and sort of design spaces and all your lovely F&B, but if they're not well lit or they're not well considered, and right up to the management philosophy, you can create these wonderful biophilic led spaces, but if the management approach is to sit on your shoulder and micromanage everything, you're going to feel quite constrained and rich. So I think if you want to implement a biophilic approach, it has to be full circle, holistically applied across all disciplines, right from sort of acoustics and interior design to lighting design, but the management philosophy and how the company approaches, make it all completely joined up and circular, for want of a better word. But ultimately, if one of the disciplines hasn't been continued or hasn't been considered, then your biophilic approach will fall down, because it has to be joined up across all disciplines that are being implemented in the space.
Brilliant. Well, thanks for that. So anybody listening, hopefully, I think that's really nice to actually initially acknowledge that you want to create a better space for your workers and for the people, and not just workers, but everybody who uses that space.
Absolutely.
And you've got to think as well. You might be entertaining your business clients and trying to win business as well. So creating a space that they're going to want to come back to and give you repeat business as well. So there's win-win everywhere. And also you can retain your staff. So lots
Yeah, I mean, it's
yeah.
staff retention, but also, if you look at some of the developers that are looking to fit out a space, the right approach in fitting out a space draws in the right tenant as well. So yeah, then you have longevity of a tenant there as well. They have longevity in staff retention, and it supports everybody along that whole chain that is living and working inside the built environment.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much. So I'm going to ask you about plants just very quickly.
Yeah.
People ask me about plants and they think that I know. I'm like, I'm not the fount of all knowledge on plants. I have a lot of plants, as you can see in the back window back thing here. Excuse me. But how would you? I mean, is it like just a very simple piece of advice would you give people on sort of like keeping their plants healthy in terms of lighting?
Yeah, I mean, smaller plants, particularly in the workplace, sort of pot plants and succulents and things, most of these species are diurnal like us. They need 8, 10, 12 hours of daylight exposure and light exposure, but they need the visual relief at night at the other end of the spectrum as well.
Okay.
I think when people talk biophilia, greenery and plants is the obvious image that's conjured up in your head. And I think green walls in particular have a bit of a misconception in workplaces at the moment. What we need to understand is if you've got great daylight exposure, this is where your green walls should be located. Once you start getting further inboard on floor plates away from windows, it becomes much more difficult to keep them alive without artificial lighting. We can absolutely supplement daylight in terms of lighting something like a green wall, and an LED is very good at tuning to a particular wavelength for flowers or greenery or blooming or there's particular species of leaf. But ultimately, if there is no daylight and you're looking for your green wall to be lit purely artificially, which can be done, you do need quite a lot of power to do this. And it contradicts a lot of the sustainability credits and a lot of the building credits that we're increasingly looking to achieve and being encouraged to look at. So with things like BREEAM and lots of these credits limit you in the amount of electrical load, the power density you can put into a floor plate. And actually, if you need to put upwards of 1,000 lux across a green wall over its entirety for 8-10 hours a day because there isn't any daylight exposure, that's a really high amount of collected load. It's a lot of watts that need to go against that wall, and it's picking and choosing where you want to put this, making sure it has got daylight as your number one proponent of illuminating a green wall, and then we can come in and supplement that. It's very difficult to advocate no daylight to agree, even though it might be the best space for you to mount this sort of vertical feature. If it's not getting any daylight, you're going to use a disproportionate amount of power keeping it alive. And I think, as you've touched on the podcast before, a poorly maintained set of plants or poorly maintained greenery is almost worse than none at all. So you've got to make sure that maintenance strategy is in and that plants are looked after to make them a success.
Yeah, exactly. Or just sort of put a virtual nature wall in and light it. I think that's the thing. So is there anything else? I'm going to ask you the final question, which I ask everybody, and I'm always excited to hear people's reaction to it. But is there anything else that you would like to add?
I mean, I think we've touched on a very broad spectrum of things. I could happily chat for another hour off and on about this. But no, I think the biggest thing is the Workplace Trends Conference coming up on the 18th of October. I'm talking it there amongst a whole host of other fantastic speakers, and I'll be talking more on the future workplace lighting and kind of biophilic-led approaches. So it's a real expansion of what we've touched on today.
That's brilliant. Well, I'm going to put a link on the podcast blurb. So if you're interested in the conference, listeners, please do go and click on the link and register. It's an amazing conference. The people are so interesting, great networking, and a lot of them become friends. And I even class some of them as family, actually, because I feel like I've seen them and know them really well. So it's really, really lovely. So my final question, Gary, is if you could paint the world with a magic brush of biophilia, what would it look like?
I love this question in your podcast because it really gets the cogs turning. What can you conjure up in your head? And it was probably genuinely the most difficult question to think of an answer to on this. And I think so often when people imagine the future or a pristine scenario, the future, particularly at the moment, feels very dystopian and grey in what people conjure up. And I think, if we could sweep a magic biophilic brush across all of that, it would be the absolute antithesis of Blade Runner 2049. It's this beautiful, lush environment, natural, flourishing world that's where all the built environment. There is a necessity for humans to survive, but it's an extension of nature. It's integrated within nature rather than being the sort of very concrete and steel heavy add-on that we find much of our cities being. Obviously, with a lighting bias, I think there's so much we don't know about lighting and so much that we're yet to find out. But I think in the future, we would have all this knowledge, we would have all this understanding, and we would be daylight focused, daylight led, and only using artificial lighting to kind of augment our spaces and elevate them, but all in tune with providing the right amount of light in the right space at the right time.
Thank you for listening to the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast.